Hey everyone, today we will understand what a Spring Cloud config server is and how we can integrate it in our microservice architecture. Before we go and understand what it is, let's first think about what are the goals we want to solve. Before we go and see what Spring Cloud config server is, let's first focus on the goals of an ideal config server solution. So first one is it should be externalized. What this means is it should not be part of your applications and it can be independently changed and deployed. Second is it should support environment specific configuration. So for, let's say for application 1, I want some config for test environment, some for prod environment and so on. So it should support that. It should be consistent, which means that it is available throughout and all the microservices can access it. It should provide version history, which means as the config is changing, there should be a way to go back to a specific version and check it. And it should provide real-time management. So if we make any change to the configuration, it should be available to the microservices in real time. Spring Cloud Config Server solves all of these goals and is used widely across enterprise softwares. So what is a Spring Cloud Config Server? It's essentially a Spring Boot application which exposes some REST endpoints which the other microservices can use to fetch the configuration. And the data source generally the data source for Spring Cloud Config Server is a Git repo. So we will first implement the Spring Cloud Config Server, and we will see how we can integrate that with our clients. Okay, so I have created this simple repo using Spring Initializer, and the dependencies I have added here is Spring Cloud Config Server and the Spring Boot framework. So to make this Spring Boot application a config server, all we need to do is go to the main application and add this annotation called enable config server. Now the second part to this is we need to pass it the Git repo path. So for this, I'll just go to my terminal. I have created this empty Git repo, called config repo, and I have initialized the Git here. So if you see, there is nothing inside this folder right now. I'll just get the path of this folder, which is my home directory plus this desktop level something. And and I go back to my config server and I add this property here called Spring Cloud Config Server Git URI, which is a file user home / the path of the repo. So this tells config server that this is the data source for it. And I've set the server port as 8888 because that's a standard we use for a config server. Now I'm going to go ahead and start the server. So it started it at port 8888. If I go back to my browser and I hit 8888, it gives me a white label error because there is nothing hosted on this endpoint. Spring Boot config server exposes its file in this format where you pass the file name / profile as the URL. So for any Spring Boot application, the default file is application, right? And the profile is default. If I hit this, it gives me something, but it doesn't have any state and property source because we don't have any file for this. So if I go back to my item and I create this file, now I have created this empty repo, config repo. Path is there, right? So that doesn't give it. Okay, so I'll create a empty file here called application properties, and I'll paste some random properties in this file, and I'm gonna save this file. Now if I go back to my browser and I hit this path again, now you see it gives some property values. So these are exactly the properties which we have pasted in that file. So now we have Spring Boot config server running, and let's try to use this Spring Boot config server in an application, in a microservice. So I've created this microservice. It's a tweet service which is connected to a MySQL database, and it have a get endpoint for getting some tweets from the database. And these are the properties for connecting to the database. There's a database URL, username, password, and so on. We don't want it to be part of this repo. We want it to be fetched from the Spring Cloud config server. Now we want this config to be just available to the tweet service application. The way you do this is you give this application a name, which is tweet service application, tweet service app, and here in the path where we pass the file name, we'll pass the service name. Okay, so I'll create a file for this particular application, tweet service app.properties, inside our Git repo. So right now there's just application.properties. I'll create new file for this. Okay, the file is there, and I'm gonna add the code, whatever was there in our local repository. I'm gonna pick it up and I'm gonna pass it to that repo. I save this and we have the file here. If I go to my config server, here I can pass this name and it gives me all of those properties, right? So these properties are now part of that config server. But how do you consume these properties in your tweet service application? So for this, what we need to do, we need to first give it the name, which we have already done. Second is we need to provide it a path to import those config from. So the format for this is this: you need to pass a you need to create this property called Spring config import, and you need to give it optional, then the config server, and you need to pass the path for the config server, which is HTTP localhost 8888. And that's it. When the application boots up, it should be able to get the config from that server. Okay, so let's start this application and see if this works. So I'm gonna do mvn spring boot run, and the application starts on 8080. So let's try to hit and see if the API is successful. So I have a get endpoint on this /tweet, which takes in the tweet ID as a query parent, and you see it gives you some data, content, hello world, and so on. So it's successfully connected to the database. I'll just hit it again with the 2, and yeah. So that's how we integrate the Spring Cloud config server to a microservice. The one part we have not covered is real-time management. So that I'll cover in a separate video. Thanks for watching this. See you in the next video.